The night my daughter-in-law mocked my southern accent, I felt every eye at the dinner table turn toward me. I had barely
And
finished
she looked at
telling
me
a
and said,
childhood
"Child, if
story
you don't get
when
out of my
Lauren
face with
twisted her
that
mouth
nonsense,
and
I'm gonna
repeated
show
my
you
words
what
in an
for."
exaggerated
I
drawl.
swear, that's exactly
A
how she
few
sounded.
relatives laughed. Then she smiled and said, "Maybe people would take you more seriously if you spoke proper English." The room went silent. My son Michael stared down at his plate. I swallowed my humiliation and left without saying a word. But 2 months later, Lauren walked into a corporate boardroom and nearly dropped her laptop when she saw me sitting at the head of the table. "Good morning," I said calmly. "As your new executive director, I think it's time we begin. Before I tell you how that impossible moment happened, let me take you back to where it all started. If you've ever been judged for where you came from, I'd love to hear your story. Please like and subscribe if stories like this speak to your heart. And before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world." Before I tell you how I ended up sitting at the head of that boardroom table, you need to understand who I was long before Lauren Peterson ever became my daughter-in-law. My name is Haley Peterson. I'm 68 years old, a widow, a mother, and until recently, a woman who believed her most important accomplishments were already behind her. I live in a quiet suburb outside Chicago. My little white house isn't impressive. The paint on the porch railing could probably use another coat, and the flower beds never look quite as neat as the ones in home magazines. But it's home. It's where my husband Daniel and I raised our son Michael. It's where we spent nearly 40 years building a life together. After Daniel passed away 8 years ago, the house became much quieter. Too quiet. At first, I didn't know what to do with myself. For decades, my days had revolved around my husband, my son, and our family routines. Suddenly, I was eating dinner alone, drinking coffee alone, and watching television with no one sitting beside me on the couch. Michael worried about me. He called every few days, sometimes every day. "Mom, you doing okay?" he'd ask, and I'd always give him the same answer. "I'm just fine, sweetheart." Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it wasn't. The bright spot in my life was Michael. He had grown into a good mankind, hard-working and ambitious without being arrogant. He worked for a large retail company and had built a successful career for himself. I was proud of him. More proud than words could ever express. So when he called one evening 3 years earlier and told me he wanted me to meet a woman named Lauren, I was thrilled. "She's amazing, Mom," he said. His voice sounded different, lighter, happier. The kind of happiness only love can bring. A month later, he brought her to dinner. I still remember opening my front door. Lauren stood beside him wearing a stylish navy blue dress and a confident smile. She was beautiful, polished, educated, the kind of woman who seemed comfortable in every room she entered. I hugged her immediately. "Welcome, honey." For a split second, she looked surprised by my enthusiasm. Then she smiled politely. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson." I laughed. "Please call me Haley." That first dinner went well enough, or at least I thought it did. I cooked roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and peach cobbler. The same meal Michael had loved since childhood. Lauren complimented the food. She asked questions about Michael growing up. She smiled at the right moments. Everything seemed normal. Looking back now, I realized the warning signs were already there. I just didn't want to see them. At one point during dinner, I told a story about growing up in rural Georgia. I laughed as I described climbing pecan trees with my cousins and getting chased by my grandmother when we came home covered in mud. Michael laughed, but Lauren's smile seemed forced. When I finished speaking, she tilted her head slightly. "Your accent is really strong." I chuckled. That's what 40 years in Chicago couldn't fix. Everyone laughed. The moment passed. or so I thought. Over the next year, Michael and Lauren became serious, then engaged, then married. I threw myself into helping with the wedding. I helped address invitations. I attended dress fittings. I spent hours crafting centerpieces by hand because Lauren wanted something elegant but affordable. I wanted her to feel loved, welcomed, accepted, because becoming part of a new family can be intimidating. I remembered what that felt like. On the wedding day, I cried harder than anyone. I watched Michael standing at the altar smiling at Lauren as she walked down the aisle. And I remember thinking how lucky we all were, how blessed, how complete our family finally felt. For a while, things truly seemed wonderful. We celebrated holidays together: Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays, family barbecues. Lauren always looked perfect. Perfect hair, perfect clothes, perfect manners. People admired her. And honestly, I admired her too. She was intelligent, driven, successful. Everything a mother hopes her son finds in a partner. But little moments began appearing. Tiny moments, easy to dismiss. At Thanksgiving one year, I was helping set the table when Lauren quietly rearranged every place setting after I'd finished. "Oh," I said, "I thought I had them right." She smiled. "You did. I just wanted them to look a little more refined." The comment wasn't cruel. Not exactly. Still, something about it stung. A few weeks later, I offered to bring homemade macaroni and cheese to Christmas dinner. Lauren hesitated, then said, "We're trying to do something a little more upscale this year." I laughed awkwardly. "Oh." She quickly added, "Nothing personal." But somehow it felt personal. Then there were the conversations. Whenever I shared stories about my childhood or old family traditions, Lauren often changed the subject. Whenever I talked about growing up in the South, her smile became strained. Whenever I used a Southern expression, she looked uncomfortable. Not angry, not openly rude, just uncomfortable. As though my way of speaking embarrassed her. I kept telling myself I was imagining it. Because what kind of person judges someone over an accent? Certainly not my daughter-in-law. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. One afternoon, Michael and Lauren came over for coffee. We sat in my kitchen discussing vacation plans. I mentioned a small town in Georgia that I'd always wanted to revisit. Lauren laughed softly. "Haley, I don't think I've ever met anyone who still says y'all as much as you do." The comment sounded playful. Everyone laughed, including me. But later that night, lying in bed, I found myself replaying the moment. Not because of what she'd said, because of how she'd said it. There had been something underneath the laughter, something judgmental, something dismissive. I tried to push the thought away. Maybe I was being oversensitive. Maybe grief and age had made me too emotional. Maybe Lauren simply came from a different world, a different generation, a different background. Still, the feeling lingered, like a small stone trapped inside a shoe. Easy to ignore at first, impossible to ignore forever. What I didn't know then was that those little moments were only the beginning. The comments would become sharper. The disrespect would become harder to hide. And before long, I would find myself sitting at a family table listening to my own daughter-in-law turn me into the punchline of a joke that would change all of our lives. If there is one thing I've learned about disrespect, it's that it rarely arrives all at once. Most of the time, it sneaks into your life quietly. A joke here, a comment there, a look, a sigh, a correction nobody asked for. By the time you realize what's happening, you've already spent months convincing yourself you're imagining it. That's exactly what happened with Lauren. After that afternoon, when she joked about how often I said y'all, I started noticing things I had ignored before. The comments became more frequent, more pointed, still subtle enough that if I complained, I would sound overly sensitive. One Saturday, Michael and Lauren invited me to brunch at a trendy restaurant downtown. The place was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows, white tablecloths, tiny portions with fancy names. The kind of restaurant where I always felt slightly out of place. I was telling a story about my cousin back in Georgia when I used the word fixin'. Lauren immediately smiled. "You're fixin' to tell another Southern story." She exaggerated the word just enough for me to notice. A couple at a nearby table glanced over. I laughed politely. "Looks like I am." Michael smiled awkwardly. Lauren continued. "You know, nobody under 70 actually says that anymore." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Well, I guess old habits die hard." She laughed. "That's one way to put it." The conversation moved on, but the uncomfortable feeling stayed. A few weeks later, Michael and Lauren hosted a dinner party at their home. Several of Lauren's friends attended. Most of them worked in corporate management. Everyone seemed highly educated, highly successful, and very aware of it. I tried my best to fit in. I asked questions, listened attentively, complimented Lauren's cooking. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then one of her friends asked where I grew up. "Georgia," I answered. The woman smiled. "Oh, I love Southern accents." Before I could respond, Lauren laughed. "You haven't heard my mother-in-law tell a long story yet." Several people chuckled. I forced a smile. Lauren looked directly at me. "Go ahead, Haley. Say something." The table laughed again. Not loudly, not cruelly, but enough. Enough to make me feel like a novelty. A performance, not a person. I changed the subject as quickly as possible. Later that evening, while helping load dishes into the dishwasher, I decided to say something. Nothing confrontational. Just honest. "Lauren," I said gently, "sometimes I feel like you make fun of the way I talk." She looked genuinely surprised. Or perhaps she was simply good at pretending. "Oh my gosh, no." She laughed. "I was teasing." "I know. Everyone loves your accent." Her smile remained perfectly polished. "It makes you memorable." The words sounded kind, yet somehow they made me feel worse, because being memorable wasn't the same as being respected. I let the conversation drop. Again, that's what I kept doing, dropping it, forgiving it, explaining it away, because I loved my son, because I wanted peace, because I didn't want to become the difficult mother-in-law. But every time I stayed silent, Lauren seemed to grow a little bolder. The next incident happened during a family barbecue. My younger sister Diane had flown in from Atlanta for the weekend. We were sitting on the patio laughing and sharing old memories when Lauren joined us. Diane has an accent even stronger than mine. Within minutes, Lauren began mimicking some of Diane's expressions. At first, Diane laughed. Then she noticed what I noticed. Lauren wasn't celebrating our Southern roots. She was entertaining herself, making us the joke. When Diane went inside, she quietly touched my arm. "Does she always do that?" I hesitated, then nodded. Diane frowned. "Why do you let her?" The question hit harder than I expected, because I didn't have a good answer. Why did I let her? Maybe because I didn't want to cause problems. Maybe because I feared losing my son. Maybe because part of me had started wondering whether Lauren was right. Maybe my accent did make me sound less educated. Maybe people did judge me. Maybe I should try harder to change. Those thoughts embarrassed me. Because deep down, I knew better. I had spent decades building a life, raising a family, managing people, solving problems, yet somehow a younger woman with a polished vocabulary was making me question myself. That realization hurt. The worst part wasn't Lauren's behavior. The worst part was Michael's silence. Again, And again he witnessed the comments, the jokes, the little humiliations, and every single time he found a way to avoid getting involved. One evening, I finally asked him about it. We were sitting on my porch drinking coffee. Lauren had stayed home. The opportunity felt rare. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, Mom." I stared into my cup. "Do you think Lauren respects me?" His expression changed immediately. Not anger, not surprise, discomfort. The kind of discomfort that comes when someone asks a question you don't want to answer. "Why would you ask that?" I shrugged. "Just curious." He sighed. "Lauren respects you." "Then why does she keep making jokes about me?" Michael looked away. "That's just her sense of humor." The answer felt like a punch, not because it was cruel, because it was cowardly. He knew. I could see it in his eyes. He knew exactly what was happening, but acknowledging it would require confronting his wife. And Michael hated conflict. Always had. When he was a little boy, he'd apologize for things he didn't even do just to keep peace between classmates. That same habit had followed him into adulthood. Unfortunately, now it was hurting me. "Mom," he said carefully, "I think maybe you're reading too much into it." I smiled, the kind of smile people use when they're trying not to cry. "Maybe." The conversation ended there, but something changed inside me that day. Not anger, not resentment, disappointment, deep disappointment. Because for the first time I realized I wasn't just fighting Lauren's disrespect. I was facing my son's unwillingness to protect me. And that realization made me feel lonelier than I had felt since Daniel died. Still, I kept showing up. Family dinners, birthdays, holiday gatherings. I smiled. I brought desserts. I asked about work. I pretended everything was fine. But underneath, a quiet tension was building. Like pressure inside a sealed container. Something was coming. I didn't know exactly what. Only that the situation couldn't continue forever. Lauren was becoming more comfortable expressing her contempt. Michael was becoming more comfortable ignoring it. And I was becoming increasingly tired of pretending it didn't hurt. What none of us realized was that the moment that would change everything was already approaching. A family gathering, a crowded table, one careless sentence, and a humiliation so public, so painful, that it would force me to confront not only Lauren, but also the woman I had forgotten I used to be. The family gathering that changed everything took place on a warm Saturday evening in late spring. My nephew Ryan had just turned 30. His wife had rented a private event room at a popular restaurant outside Chicago, and nearly 40 family members showed up to celebrate. It should have been a happy night. For most people there, it probably was. For me, it became a memory I would never forget. I arrived early carrying a homemade pecan pie, the same recipe my grandmother had taught me decades earlier. Several relatives greeted me with hugs. My sister Diane was there, a few cousins I hadn't seen in months, even some extended family members from out of state. The room buzzed with laughter and conversation. For the first hour, everything felt normal, comfortable, safe. Lauren arrived fashionably late with Michael. The moment she entered the room, attention shifted toward her. Lauren always had that effect on people. She carried herself with confidence. The expensive dress, the perfect makeup, the polished smile. People noticed her, and Lauren enjoyed being noticed. I hugged Michael. Then Lauren, "Good to see you both." "You too, Haley," Lauren said. The smile reached her lips, not her eyes. Dinner began shortly afterward. The room was arranged with several long tables pushed together. I found myself seated across from Lauren. Michael sat beside her. Diane sat beside me. At first, the conversation stayed light. Vacation plans, work stories, family updates. Everyone was enjoying themselves. Then Ryan's wife asked a simple question. What's the funniest family memory anyone has? People immediately began sharing stories. Embarrassing childhood moments, old family pranks, holiday disasters. Laughter filled the room. Eventually, someone looked at me. Haley, what about you? I smiled. Oh, I've got plenty. The room quieted. I began telling a story from my childhood in Georgia. It involved my cousins, a stubborn mule, and an unfortunate incident involving a watermelon patch. The story had made people laugh for years. As I spoke, I noticed something. Lauren wasn't listening to the story. She was watching me, watching the way I spoke, the way I pronounced words, the way my accent stretched certain vowels. At first, I ignored it. Then I saw her exchange a glance with one of her friends. A knowing look, a smirk. Something inside me tightened. Still, I kept talking. The story reached its punchline. Several relatives laughed. I smiled. Then Lauren leaned back in her chair and repeated my last sentence, word for word, except she exaggerated every syllable, every vowel, every trace of my southern accent. The table erupted with laughter. For a moment, I froze. Surely I had misunderstood. Surely she hadn't just done that. But then she did it again. This time, even more dramatically. Her voice louder, more theatrical, more mocking. People laughed harder. A few relatives looked uncomfortable. Others seemed unsure how to react. My face burned. I forced a smile, the kind people wear when they don't know what else to do. Oh, Lauren! I tried to laugh it off, but she wasn't finished. Come on, she said. I'm just having fun. Then she repeated another phrase I'd used, again in the exaggerated accent, again drawing laughter. The humiliation hit me like a physical blow. I suddenly felt very old, very small, very exposed, as though I had become entertainment, not family. Entertainment. Diane stopped smiling. I saw her expression harden. She knew exactly what was happening. Unfortunately, Lauren either didn't notice or didn't care. One cousin tried changing the subject, but Lauren kept going. The more people laughed, the bolder she became. I looked toward Michael, waiting, hoping, praying. Surely now he would say something, anything. Lauren, that's enough. Lauren, stop. Lauren, you're being rude. Just one sentence. That's all I needed. Instead, he looked uncomfortable and took a sip of his drink. Nothing more. Nothing. That hurt almost as much as Lauren's behavior. Maybe more. Because strangers don't owe you protection. Your family does. And in that moment, my son chose silence. Then came the sentence I would never forget. The sentence that replayed in my head for weeks afterward. Lauren laughed and shook her head. You know, maybe people would take you more seriously if you spoke proper English. The room went silent. Not gradually. Instantly. Forks stopped moving. Conversations ended. Even the waitstaff seemed frozen. Lauren realized too late what she had said. But the damage was done. The words hung in the air. Sharp, cruel, impossible to take back. I felt as though all the oxygen had disappeared from the room. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Diane stood up. Slowly, deliberately. That's enough. Her voice was ice cold. Lauren shifted uncomfortably. I was joking. No, Diane replied. You weren't. The room remained silent. Michael stared at the table. Lauren looked embarrassed, but not truly sorry. Not yet. I could feel dozens of eyes on me. waiting for my reaction, waiting for a confrontation, waiting for drama. Instead, I simply stood. I picked up my purse, smoothed my blouse, and smiled. A small smile, the kind people use when they're trying very hard not to fall apart. "Thank you for dinner." My voice barely sounded like my own. Then I walked away. No yelling, no insults, no scene. I just left. Behind me, I heard Diane calling my name. I heard chairs moving, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached the parking lot, tears were already running down my face. I sat inside my car and locked the doors. Then I cried. Really cried, the kind of crying that comes from accumulated hurt. Not one insult, not one bad night. Years of tiny wounds finally breaking open. I cried for my husband, because Daniel would have defended me immediately. I cried for my son, because somewhere along the way he'd become too afraid of conflict to protect his own mother. And I cried for myself, because despite everything I'd accomplished in life, one woman's opinion had somehow managed to make me feel worthless. Eventually, my phone began ringing. Diane, Michael, several relatives. I ignored them all. I wasn't ready. I drove home alone. The house felt darker than usual that night. The silence felt heavier. I changed into pajamas and sat in Daniel's old recliner. For hours, I stared at nothing, thinking, remembering, hurting. Around midnight, Michael finally left a voicemail. "Mom, please call me." His voice sounded desperate. "Lauren didn't mean it like that." I laughed bitterly. Didn't mean it. Then how exactly had she meant it? The next morning, I woke up exhausted, emotionally drained. I wandered through the house without purpose. Eventually, I found myself standing in the storage room, a room I hadn't entered in months. Boxes lined the walls, old photographs, old documents, pieces of a life I rarely revisited. Without really knowing why, I pulled one box toward me, then another, then another. What I found inside those boxes would change everything, because hidden beneath decades of dust were reminders of a woman I had almost forgotten. A woman who had once been respected, powerful, accomplished, a woman whose story was far from over. And for the first time since that humiliating dinner, I felt something unexpected stirring inside me. Not sadness, not shame, something else, something much stronger. The morning after Ryan's birthday dinner, I stood in my storage room staring at boxes I hadn't touched in years. My eyes still felt swollen from crying. My chest still ached. And Lauren's words continued echoing through my mind. "Maybe people would take you more seriously if you spoke proper English." The sentence had cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Not because I believed it, because somewhere inside me, I was angry that I had allowed someone else's opinion to hurt me so much. I wasn't a teenager. I wasn't an insecure young woman trying to find her place in the world. I was 68 years old. I'd survived hardships Lauren couldn't even imagine. Yet somehow, I had spent years shrinking myself to keep family peace. The realization bothered me. So, instead of sitting in the living room feeling sorry for myself, I started cleaning. It was something my late husband Daniel used to do whenever life felt overwhelming. "Can't always control your problems," he'd say, "but you can clean a closet." I smiled sadly as I pulled down the first dusty box. The label read, "Office Files." I almost shoved it back. Those documents belonged to another lifetime. A lifetime before retirement, before widowhood, before people started treating me like a harmless old woman. But something made me open it. Inside were folders, awards, performance reviews, employee recognition certificates. And suddenly, I found myself staring at a version of Haley Peterson I hadn't thought about in years, a version that felt almost unfamiliar. I sat cross-legged on the floor and began reading. The first document was 26 years old. A Regional Excellence Award. The second recognized record-breaking store performance. The third praised leadership development initiatives. The fourth thanked me for helping rescue a failing district. There were dozens more, maybe hundreds. As I sorted through the papers, memories returned. Not vague memories, sharp ones, clear ones, memories of long workdays. Major decisions, difficult negotiations, problems nobody else could solve. I remembered walking into struggling stores where morale was collapsing. Employees were quitting, managers were fighting, profits were disappearing. Then I remembered fixing them, one after another. Back then, people didn't call me sweet, or cute, or charming. Back then, people called me effective, competent, respected. I found an old photograph. The picture showed me standing beside a team of managers. I couldn't stop staring. I looked younger, of course, but that wasn't what shocked me. It was the confidence in my face, the certainty, the strength. Somewhere over the years, I had forgotten that woman existed. And maybe that was my biggest mistake. For nearly 40 years, I worked in retail operations. I started at the bottom, worked my way upward, learned every aspect of the business: inventory, staffing, training, customer service, leadership. By the time I retired, I had supervised dozens of locations and hundreds of employees. At one point, I became known for turning around failing stores. When executives ran out of options, they sent me. I wasn't flashy. I didn't have an MBA. I didn't use corporate buzzwords. But I understood people. And people were the heart of every business. I had almost forgotten that. Then I found a letter. A handwritten letter. The signature at the bottom immediately caught my attention. Charles Whitmore. I blinked. Charles. I hadn't thought about him in years. Charles had been one of the most respected executives I'd ever worked with. Brilliant, demanding, visionary. The kind of leader who could walk into a room and command attention without raising his voice. He had mentored me early in my career. The letter was nearly 15 years old. I unfolded it carefully. The paper had yellowed with age. As I read, tears filled my eyes. Haley, your ability to lead people is one of the rarest talents I've ever encountered. Processes can be taught. Numbers can be analyzed. Technology changes every year. But genuine leadership is different. You possess it naturally. Never underestimate the impact you've had on this company. Charles Whitmore. I read the letter twice, then 3 times. Then I sat, quietly staring at the signature. When was the last time anyone had spoken to me that way? Years, maybe a decade. Since retirement, people mostly saw me as Michael's mother. Lauren's mother-in-law, a widow, a retiree. Nobody saw the woman who had built a career. The woman who had solved problems. The woman who had led teams. And slowly, I had stopped seeing her too. That afternoon, my sister Diane called. I almost didn't answer. Eventually, I did. "How are you doing?" I laughed softly. Honestly? Not great." There was a pause. Then Diane sighed. "Good." I frowned. "Good? Yes." "What kind of answer is that?" "The honest kind." I couldn't help smiling. That was Diane. Always direct, always fearless. "You should be angry." "I am angry." "No." She paused. "You're hurt." That distinction hit me immediately, because she was right. I wasn't angry enough. I was hurt, embarrassed, ashamed, still viewing myself as the victim. Diane continued. Haley, do you realize how much you've accomplished in your life? I looked around at the papers scattered across my floor. Maybe I'm starting to. Then stop acting like Lauren gets to define your value. Her words stayed with me after we hung up. That evening, I kept sorting through boxes. Each document felt like another forgotten piece of myself. I found newspaper clippings, leadership awards, letters from employees, photos from conferences. One note came from a young assistant manager I had mentored decades earlier. She wrote, "You believed in me before I believed in myself. Because of your guidance, I became a district manager. Thank you for changing my life." I wiped away tears. Not sad tears. Different tears. The kind that come when you remember who you are. For years, I had allowed my world to become smaller. Not because anyone forced me to. Because I assumed my best years were over. Maybe that was the real tragedy. Not Lauren's cruelty. My own forgetting. As evening approached, I carried another box into the living room. Inside were old company newsletters. I flipped through them absent-mindedly. Then something caught my eye. A familiar photograph. Charles Whitmore. The accompanying article discussed his rapidly growing retail corporation. I realized something surprising. His company was still thriving, nationally recognized, massive, far larger than the organization where we'd originally worked together. I wondered briefly what Charles was doing these days. Whether he was retired, whether he even remembered me. The thought felt absurd. Of course he didn't. People like Charles met thousands of employees. Why would he remember one manager from years ago? I chuckled and set the article aside. Then my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. Almost. For some reason, I answered. "Hello?" A deep voice responded immediately. "Haley Peterson." "Yes?" A pause. Then, "Well, it's been far too many years." The voice sounded strangely familiar. My heart skipped. "Charles!" A warm laugh came through the phone. "The one and only." I sat up straight, completely stunned. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Out of all the people I expected to hear from that day, Charles Whitmore wasn't even on the list. Yet somehow, after years of silence, one of the most influential men I'd ever worked with was suddenly calling me. And before the conversation ended, he would make a request that would change the course of my life and eventually turn Lauren Peterson's entire world upside down. For several seconds after hearing Charles Whitmore's voice, I simply sat there in stunned silence. Of all the people who might have called me that day, Charles was the last person I expected. The last time we had spoken was nearly a decade earlier. Back then, I was preparing for retirement. Daniel was still alive. Life felt completely different. Yet somehow, after all those years, Charles had found my number. And apparently, he had a reason for calling. "Well," he asked warmly, "have you forgotten who I am already?" I laughed. "Not a chance." "Good." His familiar chuckle came through the phone. Some voices never change. Charles sounded older than I remembered, but not weaker. Still confident, still commanding, still unmistakably Charles Whitmore. We spent the next few minutes catching up. He asked about Daniel. I told him about my husband's passing. His voice softened immediately. "I'm sorry, Haley." "Thank you. I always admired Daniel." That touched me. Charles had only met Daniel a handful of times, yet he remembered. That was one of the reasons people respected him. He never forgot people. Eventually, he asked about retirement. I laughed. Mostly gardening church and trying not to spoil my grandchildren. Sounds peaceful. It usually is. There was a pause, a long pause, the kind that tells you the real conversation is about to begin. Then Charles sighed. Haley, the truth is, I didn't call to reminisce. I sat up straighter. I figured. Another pause. Then, I need your help. The words caught me completely off guard. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Excuse me? You heard me? I laughed nervously. Charles, you're running one of the largest retail corporations in the country. Unfortunately. I blinked. That wasn't the answer I expected. He continued. Do you know what the biggest challenge in business is? I thought for a moment. Competition? No. Technology? No. Supply chains? No. His voice grew quieter. People. That answer immediately got my attention. Because years ago, I would have given the exact same response. Charles continued. Our numbers look fine from the outside. Okay. Our investors are happy. Okay. Our stores are profitable. I frowned. Then what's the problem? His answer came instantly. The culture. The word hung in the air. Culture. I understood immediately. A company can survive declining sales. It can survive bad quarters. It can survive poor decisions. But toxic culture eventually destroys everything. Because toxic culture destroys people, and people run companies. Charles sounded tired, more tired than I had ever heard him. We're losing good employees. How bad? Worse every quarter. I listened carefully. Turnover is rising. Yes. Managers leaving. Constantly. Morale problems, everywhere. I nodded slowly. The pattern felt familiar. Dangerously familiar. Charles continued. We've brought in consultants. Did it help? No. We've hired experts. No. New executives. Several. And nothing. I leaned back in my chair. Something about the conversation was beginning to intrigue me. Not because I wanted a job, not because I missed corporate life, because for the first time in years, someone was talking to me like I still mattered, like my experience still had value. Charles finally reached the point. I want you to come take a look. I almost laughed. Charles, I'm serious. So am I. I shook my head despite knowing he couldn't see me. I've been retired for years. I know. I'm 68. I know. I haven't stepped inside a corporate office in forever. I know. His answer never changed. I know, I know, I know. Finally, I sighed. Then why me? The question lingered. Charles answered without hesitation. Because every time everyone else failed, you succeeded. I didn't know what to say. He continued. Do you remember the Milwaukee district? I laughed. How could I forget? The Milwaukee district had been a disaster. 6 struggling stores, terrible leadership, awful morale, nearly impossible circumstances. Corporate leadership expected minor improvement. Instead, our team turned it around completely. The results became legendary inside the company. Charles remembered too. You didn't fix Milwaukee with spreadsheets. No. You fixed it by understanding people. I smiled. That was always the job. Exactly. His voice sharpened. Most executives have forgotten that. The statement stayed with me, because deep down, I suspected he was right. For the next half hour, Charles described the situation. Not every detail, just enough. And what I heard worried me. Departments operating against each other. Managers competing instead of collaborating. Employee complaints increasing. Talented workers resigning. Leadership becoming disconnected from frontline staff. The company wasn't collapsing. Not yet. But the cracks were spreading. When he finally finished, I remained silent. Part of me was fascinated. Another part felt overwhelmed. This wasn't my problem anymore. I was retired. Comfortably retired. Why would I voluntarily step back into corporate chaos? Charles seemed to read my thoughts. You're trying to find reasons to say no. I laughed. Maybe. That's because you're scared. That surprised me. Scared? Yes. Of what? His answer landed harder than I expected. Of finding out you still have something left to offer. Silence. Complete silence, because he wasn't entirely wrong. After Daniel died, I gradually stopped challenging myself, stopped pushing myself, stopped believing new chapters were possible. Life became smaller, safer, predictable. Maybe I needed that for a while. Maybe grief required it. But now I wasn't so sure. Charles lowered his voice. I'm not asking you to come back permanently. Then what are you asking? Spend a few days with us. I frowned. A few days. Look around. Observe. Talk to people. Give me your honest opinion. That's it. That's it. The request sounded simple, reasonable, harmless. Yet something inside me resisted. Maybe because saying yes would mean stepping outside the life I'd built. Maybe because it would force me to remember the woman I used to be. The woman whose awards were still scattered across my living room floor. As if sensing my hesitation, Charles changed tactics. Can I ask you something? Sure. When was the last time you felt excited about something? The question hit me unexpectedly. I opened my mouth, then closed it, because I honestly didn't know. Not truly excited, not energized, not challenged, not in years. I thought about the storage room, the awards, the letters, the memories, and for the first time, I admitted something to myself. Part of me missed that life. Not the stress, not the endless meetings, but the purpose, the feeling of making a difference. Charles waited patiently. Finally, I sighed. If I say yes, what exactly happens? His answer came instantly. You fly in next week. A smile crept across my face. He already knew. He already knew I was considering it. You're very confident. I hired you, remember? I laughed despite myself. The old Charles was still there, still impossible to argue with. By the end of the conversation, I hadn't officially agreed, but I hadn't refused either, which apparently was enough for him. Before hanging up, he said one final thing. Haley, yes. I wouldn't be calling if I thought anyone else could do this. Then the line went dead. I sat alone in my living room, staring at my phone. My heart was racing. For the first time in years, something unexpected had entered my life. Possibility. I didn't know it yet, but that single phone call had already set events in motion. Events that would eventually lead me into a corporate headquarters, into a leadership crisis, and directly into the professional world of one woman who had absolutely no idea her mother-in-law was about to become part of her future. Lauren Peterson. And when our paths crossed again, neither of our lives would ever be the same. For the next 3 days, I tried convincing myself not to go. It should have been easy. After all, I was retired. I had no obligation to help Charles Whitmore, no responsibility toward his company, No desire to return to corporate life. At least that was what I kept telling myself. Unfortunately, every argument sounded less convincing than the one before. By Tuesday afternoon, I finally called him back. The phone barely rang once. "I knew you'd call," I laughed. "You seem awfully sure of yourself." "I know people." "You think you know me that well?" "No." His voice carried that familiar confidence. "I know you better." 2 days later, I found myself walking through the headquarters of Whitmore Retail Group. The building was larger than I expected, 25 stories of glass and steel rising above downtown Chicago. The lobby alone was bigger than some stores I'd once managed. As the elevator carried me upward, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Nervousness. Not fear. Excitement. The kind that comes before a challenge. The kind that reminds you you're alive. Charles greeted me personally. Despite being 73, he still moved with remarkable energy. His hair was almost entirely white now, but his sharp blue eyes remained unchanged. The moment he saw me, he smiled. "There she is," I laughed. "You make it sound like I've returned from war." "Depending on what you find, maybe you have." We spent the morning talking. Not about financial reports, not about profits, not about shareholders, about people. Always people. Charles walked me through the company's recent struggles. The numbers were respectable. Growth had slowed, but remained positive. Investors seemed satisfied. From the outside, everything appeared healthy. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. Very wrong. Employee satisfaction scores had fallen for 3 consecutive years. Management turnover was climbing. Internal complaints were increasing. Department cooperation was deteriorating. The symptoms were everywhere. The cause was harder to identify. By lunchtime, Charles handed me temporary consultant credentials. "I want complete honesty." "You may regret that." He laughed. "No, I won't." The next several days became a whirlwind. I met employees from every level of the organization. Store managers, regional directors, human resources teams, operations specialists, customer service supervisors, assistant managers. People talked, and I listened. That had always been my greatest strength. Most leaders listen only long enough to prepare their response. I listened to understand. The first thing I noticed was fear. Not obvious fear. Subtle fear. The kind people carry when they don't feel safe speaking openly. Employees carefully chose their words. Managers hesitated before answering questions. People glanced around before expressing concerns. That alone told me something important. Healthy organizations don't operate that way. Healthy organizations encourage honesty. Fear usually indicates poor leadership somewhere in the system. By the end of my first week, patterns began emerging. Not from spreadsheets, from conversations. The same complaints appeared repeatedly. Different departments, different locations, different employees. Yet the themes remained remarkably consistent. Communication problems, credit stealing, political behavior, internal competition, favoritism, micromanagement, toxic leadership practices. One afternoon, I sat alone reviewing notes in a conference room. The deeper I looked, the clearer the picture became. The company wasn't suffering from one major problem. It was suffering from hundreds of smaller ones. And those smaller problems all shared one thing in common: leadership. Not every leader. Not even most leaders. But enough to damage the culture. That realization energized me. Because culture problems can be fixed. Difficult. Yes, impossible. No. In many ways, I felt as though I had stepped back into my old life. The strange part was how natural it felt. Within days, I stopped feeling like a retired widow visiting an office. I started feeling like Haley Peterson again, the woman who solved problems, the woman who built teams, the woman who wasn't afraid of difficult conversations. Each morning, I arrived earlier. Each evening, I stayed later. Not because anyone asked me to, because I wanted to. I hadn't felt this engaged in years. One evening, Charles found me studying employee feedback reports. "You're smiling." I looked up. "I am?" "Yes." "I didn't realize." He laughed. "I told you." "Told me what?" "You weren't finished." I rolled my eyes. "Don't get carried away." "I'm serious." He sat across from me. "Do you know how many consultants I've hired over the last 3 years? How many?" 12. I nearly choked. 12. And they all focused on processes. I nodded. That sounded familiar. "Processes matter." "Of course. But people matter more." I smiled. Now he sounded like me. Over the next several weeks, I continued interviewing employees. Gradually, more people began trusting me. When people trust you, they tell the truth. And the truth is often more valuable than any report. One young manager spent nearly an hour describing how talented employees kept leaving. A district supervisor explained how internal politics rewarded the wrong behaviors. An HR specialist described rising frustration among staff. Again and again, the same themes appeared. The culture was rewarding image over substance, politics over performance, self-promotion over leadership. That realization bothered me, because eventually those values infect everything. Then came a conversation that changed the direction of my investigation. A young employee named Emily Foster requested a private meeting. At first, I assumed she wanted to discuss workplace concerns. Instead, she asked an unusual question. "Can I trust you?" I studied her carefully. She looked nervous, exhausted, frustrated. "Why do you ask?" Emily hesitated, then answered quietly. "Because most people here can't be trusted." That statement immediately got my attention. She spent the next 20 minutes describing situations she'd witnessed. Not illegal activities, not financial misconduct. Something different. Patterns of manipulation, intimidation, credit theft, employees being undermined, good workers being pushed aside, bad leaders being protected. The details were troubling, very troubling. "What department?" I asked. Emily swallowed. Then she gave me the answer. I wrote down the name. At the time, it meant nothing to me. Just another department. Just another leadership issue. But as I continued reviewing employee complaints later that evening, I noticed something strange. The same department kept appearing. Again and again and again. My curiosity intensified. I requested additional records, performance reviews, internal reports, employee feedback summaries. When the files arrived, I began reading immediately. Several hours passed. The deeper I looked, the more concerned I became. There was clearly a leadership problem there, a significant one. And at the center of that problem was a senior manager. Someone whose name appeared repeatedly. Someone employees seemed afraid to challenge. Someone powerful. Someone influential. I glanced at the personnel file, then froze. My heart nearly stopped. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen, unable to believe what I was seeing, because the manager connected to all those complaints had a name I knew very well, a name connected to my family, a name connected to the worst night of my recent life, Lauren Peterson, my daughter-in-law. And at that moment, I realized two shocking things. First, Lauren worked for Charles Whitmore's company. Second, She had absolutely no idea I was there. For a long moment, I simply stared at Lauren's personnel file. Surely there had to be some mistake. Whitmore Retail Group employed thousands of people. Chicago alone had countless corporate offices. The odds of Lauren working here seemed almost impossible. Yet there it was. Lauren Peterson, Senior Regional Operations Manager. 5 years with the company. Rapid promotions. Strong performance metrics. Excellent executive visibility. I leaned back slowly, my mind racing. The strange thing was that Lauren had never once mentioned working for Charles Whitmore's company. Not to me, not to Michael, at least not by name. She talked about work constantly. Meetings, projects, deadlines, promotions, corporate politics, but she rarely discussed specifics, and I had never asked. Now I wished I had. I closed the file and stared out the conference room window. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Another part felt deeply unsettled. The universe seemed to have an unusual sense of humor. A few weeks earlier, Lauren had publicly humiliated me at a family gathering. Now I was investigating leadership problems inside her company. The connection felt almost too unbelievable. I immediately considered telling Charles. Then I changed my mind. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted the truth. Real truth. The moment Lauren discovered I was involved, every interaction would change. People would become cautious. Stories would shift. Defenses would rise. I needed facts before emotions complicated everything. So I made a decision. I would say nothing. For now. The next morning, I requested additional information. Performance reports. Employee engagement surveys. Leadership evaluations. Exit interview summaries. The more documents I reviewed, the more complicated the situation became. At first glance, Lauren appeared successful. Very successful. Her department consistently met targets. Projects were completed on schedule. Executives praised her results. On paper, she looked like a rising star. But paper only tells part of the story. People tell the rest. And the people were telling a very different story. That afternoon, I met with Emily Foster again. Unlike many employees, Emily didn't seem interested in office politics. She spoke carefully, thoughtfully, and most importantly, honestly. "What exactly is happening in Lauren's department?" I asked. Emily hesitated. The hesitation itself was revealing. Finally, she answered. "People are afraid of her." I frowned. "Afraid?" Emily nodded. "Not physically, of course, but professionally." I listened carefully. "Nobody wants to challenge her." "Why?" "Because she always wins." The answer bothered me. Healthy leaders don't create fear. They create trust. Emily continued. "If someone disagrees with Lauren, she finds ways to make their lives difficult." "What kind of ways?" Emily took a deep breath. "Excluding people from meetings, taking away opportunities, blocking promotions, questioning performance." None of those actions sounded dramatic. That was exactly what made them dangerous. Subtle abuse often causes more damage than obvious abuse because it's harder to prove, harder to confront, harder to stop. Over the next week, I spoke with several additional employees, individually, privately. Patterns continued emerging. Different people, different experiences, same conclusions. Lauren was intelligent, capable, ambitious, and increasingly toxic. One employee described how Lauren routinely claimed credit for ideas developed by junior staff. Another described projects where team members did most of the work while Lauren received public recognition. Several mentioned favoritism. Others mentioned intimidation. What struck me most was the consistency. When multiple unrelated people describe the same behavior, it usually isn't coincidence. It's culture. One evening, I reviewed a stack of employee feedback surveys. Most were anonymous. Many mentioned leadership concerns. One comment stood out immediately. Management values visibility more than integrity. Another said, good employees leave because toxic behavior gets rewarded. Another, speaking up feels dangerous. I read those sentences repeatedly. Each one reminded me of something. Not work. Family. Lauren treated people at work the same way she treated me. The superiority, the dismissal, the subtle humiliations, the need to feel above others. Suddenly, the connection became impossible to ignore. What I had experienced at family gatherings wasn't isolated behavior. It was part of a larger pattern, a pattern she carried into every area of her life. That realization saddened me more than I expected. Because until then, I'd hoped Lauren simply disliked me. That would have been easier. Instead, it appeared she treated many people this way. Several days later, I attended a leadership meeting as an observer. Lauren was present. For the first time since discovering her role, I saw her in action. Fortunately, she didn't notice me. I sat near the back of the room while executives discussed operational challenges. Lauren entered confidently, stylishly dressed, perfect posture, perfect smile. The same woman who attended family dinners. The same woman who mocked my accent. At first, she impressed me. Truly, she spoke clearly, presented data effectively, answered questions confidently. I understood immediately why executives liked her. She knew how to manage upward. Then I started watching the people around her. That's when things became interesting. Whenever a junior manager offered an idea, Lauren subtly reframed it. Not enough to seem obvious, just enough to make the contribution appear hers. Whenever someone disagreed with her, she responded politely but dismissively. Whenever attention shifted away from her, she found ways to bring it back. Most people missed it. I didn't, because I'd spent decades managing leaders. And leadership reveals itself in small moments. After the meeting ended, I remained behind reviewing notes. A voice interrupted my thoughts. Pretty eye-opening, isn't it? I looked up. Charles stood in the doorway. I smiled. You could say that. He entered and closed the door. What are you seeing? I considered my answer carefully. A culture problem. His expression darkened. That's what I was afraid of. I nodded. But it's deeper than I expected. Charles sat across from me. How deep? I paused, then answered honestly. Deep enough that people have stopped trusting leadership. Silence filled the room, because both of us understood how serious that was. Trust is everything. Without trust, organizations slowly rot from the inside. No strategy can fix that. No technology can fix that. No marketing campaign can fix that. Only leadership can. Charles rubbed his forehead. For the first time, he looked every bit of 73 years old. What would you do? The question surprised me. What do you mean? If this were your company? I thought carefully, then spoke. I'd stop looking at numbers. His eyebrow lifted. Interesting. I'd start looking at leaders. The room fell quiet, because deep down, both of us knew exactly where the problem lived. Not in spreadsheets, not in sales reports, not in budgets, in people. Specifically, the people leading other people. As the weeks passed, I continued gathering information. And the more evidence I collected, the more one name continued appearing. Lauren Peterson. Again and again and again. Every path seemed to lead back to her department, her influence, her decisions, her behavior. Yet she remained completely unaware of my involvement. At family dinners, she spoke about work exactly as before, confident, proud, certain of her future. Meanwhile, I listened quietly, saying almost nothing, observing, waiting, not for revenge, for clarity. Because before making any judgment, I wanted undeniable facts. And soon enough, those facts would begin arriving, in greater numbers than anyone expected, including Lauren herself. What none of us knew was that an even bigger change was approaching. A change that would affect the entire company. A change that would place me in a position neither Lauren nor I could have imagined. Because Charles Whitmore was preparing to make an announcement. And when he did, everything would change. The announcement came 3 weeks later. By then, I had spent nearly 2 months consulting for Whitmore Retail Group. What began as a short visit had evolved into something much larger. I was attending leadership meetings, reviewing strategic plans, meeting with executives, working directly with Charles. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like an outsider. Not because I had forgotten my age, not because I suddenly wanted a new career, because I had rediscovered something important. Purpose. Every morning, I woke up energized. Every evening, I went home mentally exhausted, but deeply satisfied. It reminded me of the best years of my professional life. The years when I knew I was making a difference. One Monday morning, Charles called me into his office. The moment I walked in, I sensed something was different. He looked serious, not worried, determined. The distinction mattered. "Close the door." I obeyed, then sat across from him. For several seconds, he said nothing. That alone made me nervous. Charles was not a man who struggled to find words. Finally, he leaned forward. "I'm retiring." Even though I knew it would happen eventually, hearing the words still surprised me. I stared at him. When? Soon. How soon? 3 months. I blinked. That was far sooner than expected. The board had assumed he would remain another year. Maybe 2. Charles smiled faintly. "I've been doing this for 50 years, Haley." "I know." "I'm tired." For the first time, I truly saw it. Not weakness, fatigue. The fatigue that comes from carrying enormous responsibility for decades. I understood immediately. Leadership ages people, especially good leadership. "Have you told the board?" "Not officially." I nodded slowly. The implications were enormous. Charles Whitmore wasn't just another executive. He was the company. His departure would create uncertainty throughout the entire organization. Employees would panic. Investors would worry. Competitors would pay attention. Everything would change. "What happens next?" I asked. Charles stood and walked toward the window. "The board will choose new leadership." I followed his gaze toward the city skyline. Then he said something that nearly stopped my heart. "I've already made my recommendation." I frowned. "Who?" He turned around. His eyes locked onto mine. "You." For several seconds, I genuinely thought he was joking. Then I realized he wasn't smiling. He was completely serious. I laughed nervously. "Charles." "No. I'm 68. So, I'm retired." "We're retired." I shook my head. "This is ridiculous." "Why?" The question irritated me. "Why?" I almost laughed. "Because there are dozens of qualified executives here. Hundreds. Maybe. He returned to his desk. But none of them have done what you've accomplished these past 2 months. I opened my mouth, closed it, then tried again. This isn't the same thing. It is exactly the same thing. His voice remained calm, steady, confident, the same confidence that had once convinced me to take impossible assignments decades earlier. I don't have an MBA. Neither did he. I've been out of the corporate world for years. You've been fixing it since you arrived. I sighed. This conversation was becoming frustrating, mostly because part of me couldn't dismiss his arguments. Charles slid a folder across the desk. Look. Reluctantly, I opened it. Inside were performance reports, employee engagement data, retention statistics, leadership assessments, metrics from the past 8 weeks. I stared, then stared harder. The numbers were remarkable. Employee satisfaction was rising. Management turnover had slowed. Internal communication scores had improved. Multiple struggling departments showed measurable progress. Several executive teams reported better collaboration. I looked up. What is this? You? No. Yes. I shook my head. This was everyone's work. Charles smiled. A good leader always says that. I hated how much that sounded like him. The following weeks became a whirlwind. Charles officially announced his retirement. The reaction was immediate. News spread throughout headquarters. Employees whispered in hallways. Executives held emergency meetings. Rumors exploded. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who would replace Charles Whitmore? Several obvious candidates emerged. Senior vice presidents, regional presidents, longtime executives, people with prestigious resumes and impressive titles. My name wasn't among them, at least not publicly, and that suited me perfectly. The last thing I wanted was attention. Meanwhile, my investigation continued. Unfortunately, the evidence surrounding Lauren continued growing. More employee complaints surfaced. More testimony emerged. More concerns appeared. None of it justified immediate termination, but all of it pointed toward a serious leadership problem. The situation troubled me deeply, not because Lauren was my daughter-in-law, because she had potential, real potential. She was intelligent, driven, capable. But ambition without character becomes dangerous. And Lauren's ambition seemed increasingly disconnected from integrity. One afternoon, I attended a board meeting as an advisor. Near the end, discussion shifted toward succession planning. The atmosphere immediately changed. Tension filled the room. Board members debated qualifications, experience, vision, leadership, results. For nearly 2 hours, names moved back and forth across the table. Then Charles spoke. The room fell silent. When Charles Whitmore spoke, people listened. Always. He stood slowly. I'd like to make my recommendation. Every eye turned toward him, including mine, even though I already knew what he intended to say. The chairman nodded. Go ahead. Charles looked around the room, then spoke clearly. I recommend Haley Peterson. The silence that followed felt endless. Several board members stared. One actually blinked twice. Another leaned backward in his chair. Someone dropped a pen. I couldn't blame them. The recommendation sounded absurd. A retired widow, a consultant, a woman who hadn't sought the position, not exactly the traditional choice. Questions immediately followed. Tough questions. Expected questions. Why her? Why now? Can she handle it? Will employees accept it? What about investors? What about experience? Charles answered every single one, methodically, confidently, relentlessly. Then something unexpected happened. Other board members began supporting him. Not because of personal loyalty, because they had seen the results. They had reviewed the data. They had watched the cultural shift. They had observed employees responding positively. By the time the discussion ended, momentum had clearly changed. A formal vote was scheduled. I spent the next several days in a state of disbelief. Part of me expected the board to reject the idea. That seemed reasonable, logical, likely. Then voting day arrived. I sat quietly in a conference room waiting. My stomach twisted itself into knots. I hadn't been this nervous in decades. When the chairman finally entered, I immediately searched his expression for clues. He smiled. That was all I needed. "Congratulations." The word hit me like a wave. I stared at him, speechless. The chairman extended his hand. "The board has unanimously approved your appointment as interim executive director." Unanimously, not narrowly, not reluctantly, unanimously. I shook his hand, still struggling to process what had happened. After he left, I sat alone in silence, thinking about Daniel, thinking about my younger self, thinking about every challenge that had led me here. A woman who had been mocked for her accent only weeks earlier had somehow become leader of one of the country's largest retail organizations. Life truly was unpredictable. Then another thought struck me, a much more immediate one. Lauren. I suddenly realized something astonishing. She didn't know. Nobody had informed her yet. As far as Lauren knew, I was still her retired mother-in-law. The woman she mocked. The woman she underestimated. The woman she dismissed. Which meant that very soon she would walk into a leadership meeting expecting an ordinary day. And instead, she would discover that the person sitting at the head of the table was me. Her new executive director. Her boss. And judging by what I knew about Lauren Peterson, that moment was going to be unforgettable. The first executive meeting of my new role was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock. I barely slept the night before. Not because I doubted my ability, not because I feared the responsibility. I was thinking about Lauren. For weeks, I had managed to keep my involvement at Whitmore Retail Group hidden. At family dinners, I listened politely while she talked about work. She had no idea I knew her department. No idea I had reviewed employee complaints. No idea I had attended meetings where her leadership style was discussed. And she certainly had no idea that she was about to walk into a conference room and discover her retired mother-in-law sitting at the head of the executive table. Part of me dreaded the moment. Part of me was curious. Mostly, I wanted to handle it correctly. Because despite everything Lauren had done, I refused to become the kind of leader who abused power. The easy path would have been revenge. The satisfying path, the emotional path. But leadership wasn't about emotions. Leadership was about responsibility. And if I couldn't separate personal feelings from professional decisions, I didn't deserve the position. At 8:30 that morning, I arrived at headquarters. Employees greeted me differently now. Not as a consultant, not as a visitor, as executive director. The title still felt strange. I wasn't sure it would ever feel completely natural. Charles had officially stepped aside 3 days earlier. The transition had been smoother than expected. Most employees seemed optimistic. Some were surprised. Others were skeptical. That was understandable. Trust had to be earned, not demanded. I entered the executive conference room 20 minutes early. The room was impressive. Long polished table, floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass. I placed my notes in front of me and reviewed the agenda. Quarterly performance, department updates, employee retention initiatives, leadership accountability measures. Nothing unusual, at least on paper. The unusual part was still 10 minutes away. Executives gradually entered. Some smiled, some nodded respectfully. Others still seemed unsure what to make of me. I didn't blame them. A 68-year-old widow from Georgia wasn't exactly the candidate most people expected to lead a major corporation. One by one, seats filled. The atmosphere remained professional. Calm. Then the door opened again. Lauren walked in. She looked confident, composed, completely unaware. For a brief moment, she didn't see me. She was reviewing notes on her tablet while entering the room. Then she looked up and froze. The transformation was immediate. 1 second, she was walking normally. The next, she looked as though she'd walked into a brick wall. Her eyes widened, her face lost color, her hand tightened around the tablet. For several seconds, she simply stared. I watched realization spread across her face. Confusion, shock, disbelief. Then, recognition. The room grew noticeably quieter. Several executives noticed the unusual reaction. No one understood it, except Lauren and me. I offered a polite smile. Nothing more. No satisfaction, no smugness, no triumph. Just professionalism. "Good morning, Lauren." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. "Haley?" The word escaped before she could stop herself. Several people looked confused. One executive glanced between us, clearly wondering why a senior manager was addressing the executive director by her first name. Lauren realized her mistake immediately. She straightened, cleared her throat, and sat down. The silence felt almost physical. I waited a moment, then began the meeting. "Good morning, everyone." My voice remained calm, steady. "Let's get started." For the next hour, I focused entirely on business, performance metrics, strategic priorities, operational concerns, the same way I would have handled any executive meeting. At first, Lauren barely spoke. That alone was remarkable. Normally, she contributed constantly. Today, she looked distracted, shaken. Several times, I caught her staring at me. Each time, she quickly looked away. I could only imagine what was happening inside her head. The woman she mocked for her accent. The woman she viewed as unsophisticated. The woman she considered beneath her. Now occupied the highest position in the company. Life has a way of teaching lessons nobody expects. Eventually, discussion shifted toward regional operations. Lauren's area of responsibility. I turned toward her. "Lauren, would you like to provide an update?" The room became very still. Every executive present expected a routine report. Only Lauren understood the deeper significance. She swallowed, then nodded. "Of course." To her credit, she recovered quickly, very quickly. Her presentation was polished, detailed, professional, exactly what I expected. The truth was something Lauren still didn't understand. I had never questioned her intelligence or her competence. Her problem wasn't capability. Her problem was character. When she finished, several executives complimented the report. I did too, because it deserved recognition. That seemed to surprise her. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. Perhaps she expected immediate retaliation, public embarrassment, something. Instead, she received exactly what every employee deserved: fairness. The meeting concluded shortly before noon. As executives filed out, Lauren remained seated, clearly waiting. Within minutes, the room emptied, leaving only the two of us. Silence settled between us. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Lauren stood. "This is unbelievable." I closed my notebook. "What is you?" I smiled slightly. "That's not very specific." Her expression tightened. Your executive director. Yes. How? The question wasn't rude, just stunned. I considered answering, then decided against it. That's a long story. Lauren laughed nervously. The sound carried no humor. I don't understand. That's okay. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Something else was happening now. Fear. For the first time since I'd known Lauren, I saw genuine fear. Not because she thought I would fire her, because she suddenly realized how much power she no longer controlled. The balance had shifted. Completely. You didn't tell me. I looked at her carefully. You never asked. The answer landed harder than I intended, because it was true. Lauren had spent years assuming she already knew everything worth knowing about me. She never bothered asking questions, never showed curiosity, never looked beyond her assumptions. Now she was discovering how wrong those assumptions had been. I didn't know you had this background. I know. Her gaze dropped briefly, then returned. For the first time, she seemed genuinely uncertain, almost vulnerable. Unfortunately, the moment passed quickly. Lauren regained her composure. The polished corporate version of herself reappeared. Well, she forced a smile. Congratulations. Thank you. Another awkward silence followed. Then she left. As the door closed behind her, I sat quietly, reflecting, not celebrating, not gloating, just thinking. Because despite everything, I felt no satisfaction, only responsibility. The real challenge hadn't begun yet. Discovering Lauren's reaction was easy. Leading fairly despite our personal history would be much harder. Later that evening, Michael called. His voice sounded unusually excited. Mom! Hi, sweetheart. Why didn't you tell me? I laughed. I assume you're referring to the promotion. Everybody's talking about it. News traveled fast, especially inside families. I wanted to wait. Michael sounded amazed. Executive director. I smiled. It still feels strange. Then he said something that caught my attention. Lauren's been quiet all day. I looked out my living room window, watching the sunset, thinking carefully. That wasn't surprising, because for the first time in years, Lauren Peterson had encountered something she couldn't control. And deep down, I suspected this was only the beginning. Because while Lauren was struggling to process my new position, the investigation into her leadership behavior was continuing. The evidence was still growing. The complaints were still coming. And soon, decisions would have to be made. Difficult decisions. Decisions that would test not only Lauren's future, but also my integrity as a leader. The week after my first executive meeting felt like walking across a frozen lake. Everything looked stable from the surface, but underneath, pressure was building. News of my appointment spread quickly throughout Whitmore Retail Group. Employees reacted in different ways. Some were excited, some were skeptical, some seemed cautiously optimistic, and a few executives clearly wondered how long a retired woman from Georgia could survive in the position. I didn't take it personally. Leadership always attracts doubt, especially when you don't fit expectations. Meanwhile, Lauren was struggling. I could see it, not because she said anything directly, because her behavior changed. The confident woman who once controlled every room she entered suddenly seemed distracted, more cautious, more guarded. At meetings, she watched me carefully. At family gatherings, she became unusually quiet. Even Michael noticed. One Sunday afternoon, Michael invited me over for dinner. The atmosphere felt strange the moment I arrived. Lauren greeted me politely. Very politely. Almost excessively polite. It was the kind of politeness people use when they're unsure where they stand. I found myself feeling unexpectedly sad. Not angry, sad. Because respect given only after someone gains power isn't really respect. It's fear. And fear was not what I wanted from Lauren. During dinner, conversation stayed superficial. Work, weather, weekend plans. No one mentioned the obvious. Eventually, Michael cleared his throat. So, Lauren immediately looked uncomfortable. I nearly smiled. He continued. Executive director. I laughed softly. Apparently. Michael shook his head. I still can't believe it. Neither can I. That answer was honest. Because despite everything that had happened, part of me still expected to wake up and discover the entire experience had been a dream. Lauren remained silent. Almost too silent. The old Lauren would have dominated the conversation. Now she barely contributed. Something had changed. The power dynamic had shifted, and neither of us knew exactly what to do with it. The next morning, I returned to headquarters. Waiting on my desk was a thick folder from Human Resources. The cover page immediately caught my attention. Leadership Accountability Review. I had requested it 2 weeks earlier. Now the completed findings had arrived. My stomach tightened, because I already suspected what I would find. The report examined employee concerns across multiple departments. Turnover trends, promotion practices, management complaints, performance discrepancies, employee engagement surveys. The information was extensive and troubling. I spent nearly 4 hours reviewing every page. Patterns became impossible to ignore. Several departments showed moderate issues. A few showed significant concerns. One department stood out above all others. Lauren's, again and again and again. The same themes continued appearing. Employee intimidation, credit misappropriation, retention problems, fear-based management, communication breakdowns. The evidence wasn't yet conclusive, but it was growing. Fast. That afternoon, I met privately with Human Resources Director Karen Mitchell. Karen had worked in HR for over 20 years, experienced, professional, careful, the kind of person who didn't exaggerate, which made her observations particularly important. We sat in my office reviewing findings. Karen looked concerned. How serious is it? I asked. She took a deep breath. More serious than we'd like. I nodded. That matched my own assessment. Karen opened another file. We've had complaints before. Regarding Lauren. Yes? The answer surprised me. How many? Karen hesitated. More than enough. I leaned forward. Why wasn't anything done? Karen sighed. That single sigh told me a lot. Results. I frowned. Explain. Lauren consistently delivered strong numbers. There it was, one of the oldest mistakes in leadership, protecting toxic performers because they produce results. Karen continued. When someone hits targets, people overlook things. I hated hearing that, because it was true. Far too many organizations tolerate harmful behavior as long as profits remain strong. Until eventually, the culture becomes poisoned. Then everyone wonders how it happened. The answer is always the same. Leadership looked away. By the end of the meeting, Karen and I agreed on several next steps. Nothing dramatic, nothing punitive, just deeper investigation, more interviews, more documentation, more facts. Facts mattered, especially when family was involved, because no one could ever accuse me of targeting Lauren unfairly. Every decision needed to be supported by evidence. That evening, Emily Foster requested another meeting. I immediately agreed. Over the past several weeks, Emily had become one of the most credible sources of information in the organization. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't vindictive. She simply wanted the truth. When she entered my office, she looked nervous, more nervous than usual. "Everything okay?" I asked. She sat down slowly. "Not really." That got my attention. Emily placed a folder on my desk. "I wasn't sure who else to give this to." I opened it. Inside were project records, email chains, meeting summaries, performance evaluations. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Then I started reading. My expression slowly hardened. Several projects had been credited to Lauren, except the documentation suggested something different. In multiple cases, junior employees had developed the original concepts. They performed most of the work. They solved the major problems, yet public recognition consistently flowed upward, toward Lauren. I looked at Emily. Where did this come from? "People have been saving records." The answer surprised me. "Saving records?" She nodded. "They didn't think anyone would listen." The statement hit me harder than expected, because that's what toxic leadership creates. Hopelessness. People stop expecting fairness, stop expecting accountability, stop expecting anyone to care. So they quietly collect evidence, waiting, hoping for someone to finally listen. I spent the next hour reviewing the material. By the end, my concern had deepened considerably. Not because the documents proved everything, because they supported what employees had already been describing. Patterns. Consistent patterns. The following week brought additional challenges. Several senior executives pushed back against the cultural reforms I was implementing. Not openly. Subtly. The way experienced corporate leaders often do. Some argued that employee satisfaction was secondary to performance. Others claimed stronger accountability would slow growth. A few questioned whether culture problems were being exaggerated. I listened patiently, then asked one question. If our culture is healthy, why are good people leaving? The room became quiet. Nobody had a convincing answer, because there wasn't one. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. Every new piece of evidence pointed in the same direction, and at the center of that direction stood Lauren Peterson. Meanwhile, outside the office, family tensions continued growing. One evening, Michael called unexpectedly. His voice sounded troubled. "Mom, what's wrong?" He hesitated, then sighed. "I think Lauren's scared." I looked out my office window. The city lights shimmered below. Part of me felt sympathy. Another part felt frustration. Fear often arrives when accountability finally appears. "What makes you say that?" "She's worried about work." I remained careful, very careful. "I see." Michael lowered his voice. "Is she in trouble?" The question hung between us. For several seconds, I said nothing. Then I answered honestly. "Michael, I can't discuss employee matters." He sighed heavily. That answer told him more than words could. After we hung up, I sat alone in silence, thinking, reflecting, wondering. Because despite everything Lauren had done, I took no pleasure in her discomfort. I wanted growth, not destruction. Accountability, not revenge. Unfortunately, accountability often feels like punishment to people who have avoided it for too long. And soon, accountability was coming. The investigation was gaining momentum. The evidence was becoming stronger. More employees were stepping forward. More records were surfacing. More truths were emerging. And before long, Lauren Peterson would find herself facing questions that confidence alone could no longer answer. Questions that would force her to confront not only what she had done to others, but also the person she had become. The first employee who officially came forward did not surprise me. The second didn't surprise me either. By the fifth, however, I realized we had crossed an important line. This was no longer a collection of isolated complaints. This was a pattern, a serious one, and patterns are difficult to explain away. The investigation into leadership concerns had been expanding for weeks. Human Resources was conducting interviews. Department records were being reviewed. Performance evaluations were being compared against employee testimony. Most importantly, people were finally talking. For years, many employees had remained silent. Now, they were beginning to believe someone might actually listen. That changed everything. On Tuesday morning, Karen Mitchell from Human Resources entered my office carrying 2 thick folders. She closed the door behind her. Her expression told me the conversation would not be pleasant. "How bad?" I asked. Karen exhaled slowly. "Worse than we expected." I nodded. Part of me had already suspected that. She opened the first folder. "More employees have come forward." "How many?" 12. I sat back. 12. That number mattered. 1 complaint could be a misunderstanding. 2 might be a conflict. 12 suggested something much deeper. Karen slid several documents across my desk: employee statements, interview summaries, supporting evidence. I spent the next hour reading. The stories varied, the themes did not. One employee described presenting an innovative logistics solution during a departmental planning session. A week later, Lauren presented the same idea to senior leadership as her own. The employee received no recognition. Lauren received praise. Another employee described being excluded from important meetings after disagreeing with Lauren during a project review. A third explained how promotions often seemed connected to loyalty rather than performance. A fourth described constant fear of making mistakes, because criticism was often public while praise was rare. As I read, a knot formed in my stomach. Because none of these stories sounded impossible. In fact, they sounded entirely consistent with the woman I knew. The woman who mocked accents. The woman who valued appearances above character. The woman who believed status determined worth. I hated that realization, because part of me still wanted to believe Lauren was simply immature, flawed, misguided. Instead, the evidence suggested a much larger problem. That afternoon, Emily Foster returned. This time, she wasn't alone. 3 additional employees accompanied her. They looked nervous, very nervous. I immediately understood why. Speaking against a senior manager is risky. Even when protections exist, fear doesn't disappear overnight. We met privately in a conference room. No executives, no supervisors, no interruptions, just conversation. The first employee spoke quietly. At times, her voice shook. She described spending nearly 6 months developing a major operational improvement. After completing the project, Lauren presented the results to leadership without mentioning the team's contributions. The employee received no acknowledgement, no recognition, nothing. The second employee described repeated intimidation, not yelling, not threats, something more subtle. Questions designed to undermine confidence. Comments designed to create doubt. Conversations designed to remind employees who held power. The third employee described favoritism. Opportunities repeatedly flowing toward employees who supported Lauren. Others being quietly pushed aside. As I listened, I noticed something remarkable. None of them sounded angry. Most sounded exhausted. That told me more than any accusation. Anger fades. Exhaustion accumulates. Exhaustion is what happens when people spend years fighting battles they cannot win. After the meeting ended, I remained seated alone for several minutes, thinking, reflecting. trying to separate personal feelings from professional responsibilities, because the truth was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Lauren wasn't simply an ambitious manager. She was contributing to the very culture problems Charles had hired me to solve. And that fact placed me in an impossible position, or at least it felt impossible. That evening, I reviewed additional records from human resources. Performance data, promotion histories, department turnover statistics. The numbers painted an ugly picture. Lauren's department consistently achieved strong business results, but employee retention was among the lowest in the company. Exit interview dissatisfaction was significantly higher than average. Internal transfer requests were unusually frequent. People weren't leaving because they disliked the company. They were leaving because they wanted to escape the leadership. One particular exit interview caught my attention. The employee had written, "I loved my work. I loved my team. I just couldn't work under Lauren anymore." I read that sentence 3 times, then 4. Simple, direct, powerful. A few days later, Karen informed me that additional documentation had surfaced. Emails, project histories, meeting records. Nothing illegal, nothing criminal, but enough to reveal patterns, repeated patterns. One email chain was especially revealing. A junior employee proposed a strategic initiative. Several weeks later, Lauren presented the initiative to senior leadership. The language was nearly identical. The concepts were identical. Yet the original employee's involvement had been erased. Technically, Lauren could argue she merely refined the idea. Technically. But leadership isn't judged only by technicalities. It's judged by integrity. And integrity seemed increasingly absent. The following Monday, the executive leadership team met to review preliminary findings. Tension filled the room. Everyone understood the significance. Nobody wanted a leadership scandal, especially not involving a senior manager with strong performance metrics. One executive spoke first. "These are still allegations." Karen immediately responded, "They're supported by documentation." Another executive frowned. "Documentation can be interpreted." I remained silent, listening, observing. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Eventually, someone turned toward me. "What do you think?" The room grew quiet. I chose my words carefully. "Results matter." Several executives nodded. "However, results achieved through toxic leadership eventually become unsustainable." Silence. I continued. "Organizations teach a people what behavior they reward." That sentence landed heavily, because everyone understood its meaning. If toxic leaders succeed, others imitate them. If manipulation gets promoted, manipulation spreads. If character becomes optional, culture deteriorates. Slowly, then suddenly. Karen opened another folder. "This is from Emily Foster." I recognized the name immediately. Inside were additional records, project ownership histories, performance acknowledgments, contribution tracking. The evidence was difficult to dismiss. Several major accomplishments credited to Lauren appeared heavily dependent on work performed by others. Again, nothing definitive on its own. Together, however, the pattern became unmistakable. The room felt different now, less defensive, more concerned. People were beginning to see what I had seen. Not a single mistake, a leadership style, a pattern of behavior, a culture problem embodied in one person. After the meeting ended, I walked alone through headquarters. Employees moved through hallways, answered emails, attended meetings, laughed with coworkers, built careers, pursued goals. Trusted leadership to create a fair environment. That trust mattered, more than quarterly profits, more than executive titles, more than public image. Trust was the foundation of everything. Without it, organizations eventually collapse from the inside. I stopped near a large window overlooking the city. For several minutes, I simply stood there, thinking about Lauren, thinking about Michael, thinking about what was coming next. Because the investigation had reached a critical point. Evidence was no longer trickling in. It was accumulating rapidly. Human Resources was preparing final findings. Leadership reviews were approaching. Accountability discussions had already begun. And for the first time, it seemed entirely possible that Lauren Peterson might face serious professional consequences. Not because of her relationship to me, because of her own choices. Because eventually every leader encounters the same question. Not whether they can produce results, whether they can produce results without sacrificing integrity. And soon, Lauren would have to answer that question in front of people who could no longer be distracted by polished presentations, impressive metrics, or carefully crafted image. The truth was finally catching up, and the truth can be patient, but it rarely stays hidden forever. The final review hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. By the time that day arrived, everyone involved understood the seriousness of the situation. Human Resources had completed its investigation. Executive leadership had reviewed the findings. Employee testimony had been documented. Supporting records had been verified. The process had taken weeks, deliberately, carefully. Fairness required patience, and fairness mattered more than speed, especially now. I arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. The city was still waking up. Traffic moved slowly below my office windows. Gray clouds covered the skyline. The weather somehow matched my mood. Heavy. Not because I doubted the evidence, because I knew what the day would mean. For Lauren, for Michael, for our family, and for me. Despite everything Lauren had done, I had never wanted this outcome. I had wanted growth, reflection, change. Unfortunately, change often arrives only after consequences. At 9 o'clock, the hearing began. The conference room was smaller than our executive meeting space, more private, more formal. Present were representatives from Human Resources, Legal Counsel, Executive Leadership, and Lauren herself. I entered last. The room immediately fell silent. Lauren sat at one side of the table. Her usual confidence was gone. The transformation was striking. Her shoulders looked tense. Her face looked tired. For the first time since I had known her, she appeared vulnerable. I took my seat. The meeting began. Karen Mitchell presented the findings, methodically, professionally, without emotion. One category at a time. Employee intimidation. Documentation followed. Credit misappropriation. Documentation followed. Retaliatory behavior. Documentation followed. Favoritism concerns. Documentation followed. Pattern after pattern emerged. No single issue would have destroyed Lauren's career. Together, however, they painted a troubling picture. As Karen spoke, Lauren remained silent, occasionally taking notes, occasionally looking down, never interrupting, never objecting. The old Lauren would have challenged everything, argued every detail, controlled the room. This Lauren understood something important. The evidence was real. Eventually, Karen finished. The room became quiet. The chairman looked toward Lauren. "Would you like to respond?" For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Lauren slowly lifted her head. I expected denial, defensiveness, excuses. Instead, she surprised me. Her voice was quiet, much quieter than usual. "I disagree with some of the interpretations." The statement was careful, measured, professional. She continued, "But I can't deny the facts." Silence filled the room. Several executives exchanged glances. Lauren looked exhausted. "As I reviewed the documents," she continued, "I realized something." She paused. For the first time, I heard genuine emotion. I became the kind of leader I promised myself I would never become. No one spoke, because nobody expected that answer, least of all me. Lauren looked toward the table, not directly at anyone, almost as though she were speaking to herself. I kept telling myself results justified everything. Another pause. I thought winning mattered most. Her voice cracked slightly. And eventually I stopped noticing who got hurt. The room remained silent. Not hostile, not sympathetic, simply listening. Lauren swallowed hard, then said something that surprised me even more. I spent so much time proving I was successful that I forgot how to be decent. The words hung in the air, heavy, painful, honest. For the first time since the investigation began, I saw something different. Not arrogance, not ambition, regret. Real regret. Unfortunately, regret does not erase consequences. The chairman thanked her, then requested a brief recess. Lauren left the room. The door closed behind her. Immediately, discussion began. Not about guilt. That question had already been answered. About consequences. Different executives proposed different options. Additional coaching, probation, reassignment, demotion, termination. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Throughout it all, I listened more than I spoke. Because despite my position, I understood something important. My relationship to Lauren created complications. I needed to be careful, objective, measured. Eventually, someone turned toward me. "What is your recommendation?" The question settled over the room. Everyone waited. I thought carefully, then answered. "Termination isn't appropriate." Several people nodded. I continued. "But neither is maintaining the current role." Silence. "The behavior was serious." More nods. "The impact was significant." Again agreement. "Accountability is necessary." The discussion continued. By the time it ended, a decision had been reached. Unanimously. The hearing reconvened shortly after noon. Lauren returned. She looked pale, tired, prepared for the worst. The chairman spoke first. His voice remained calm, professional. "After reviewing all findings, leadership has reached a decision." Lauren sat perfectly still. No movement, no expression, just waiting. "The company has determined that continued placement in your current leadership role is not appropriate." A muscle tightened in her jaw, but she said nothing. The chairman continued. "You will be removed from your management position, effective immediately." The words landed heavily. I watched Lauren carefully. She closed her eyes briefly, only briefly, then opened them again. The chairman wasn't finished. "You will be offered an opportunity to remain with the company in a non-management role." That surprised her. I could see it immediately. Perhaps she had expected termination. Instead, she was being given something far more difficult. A chance to start over. A chance to rebuild. A chance to earn trust rather than demand it. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Lauren left quietly, without argument, without drama, without resistance. And somehow that made everything sadder. That evening, I drove home emotionally exhausted. I hoped for peace. Instead, I found Michael waiting on my front porch. The moment I saw him, I knew. He knew everything. Every complaint, every finding, every consequence. I unlocked the front door. Neither of us spoke until we sat inside. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I read the report." I nodded. His eyes looked red, as though he hadn't slept. "Is it all true?" The question hurt, because he already knew the answer. "Most of it." Michael stared at the floor. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then something unexpected happened. He began crying, not dramatically, quietly, the kind of crying people do when disappointment becomes too heavy to carry. "I failed you." I blinked. "What?" His voice shook. "I failed you, Mom." The words hit me harder than anything that had happened all day. Michael looked up. Tears filled his eyes. I knew. I remained silent because I needed him to continue. "I knew Lauren made comments." His voice cracked. "I knew she embarrassed you." Another tear rolled down his face. "I knew she crossed lines." The room felt painfully quiet. Then came the sentence that broke my heart. "I just didn't want to deal with it." There it was, the truth. Not cruelty, cowardice, not hatred, avoidance. Michael covered his face. "I kept telling myself it wasn't serious." I said nothing. He continued. "Every time she made a joke about your accent, I stayed silent." Another pause. "Every time she disrespected you, I stayed silent." Then finally, "And every time I stayed silent, I betrayed you." The word betrayal hung between us. Neither of us could escape it, because it was true. Lauren's actions had hurt me, but Michael's silence had allowed the hurt to continue. For years. He looked at me with the same expression he had worn as a little boy whenever he knew he'd done something wrong. "I'm sorry." I felt tears filling my own eyes. Not because I wanted an apology, because I had waited so long to hear it. Years. Years of silence. Years of excuses. Years of pretending everything was fine. And finally, my son saw the truth. Not about Lauren, about himself. The two of us sat quietly for a long time, neither speaking, both hurting, both healing. Because sometimes the most painful truths are also the most necessary. And although Lauren's professional downfall had reached its conclusion, a much more important question still remained unanswered. Could our family survive what came next? The weeks that followed were some of the most emotionally complicated of my life. Not because of business. Business was actually improving. Employee satisfaction continued rising. Turnover declined. Departments collaborated more effectively. The culture changes we had implemented were beginning to take root. Professionally, things were moving in the right direction. Personally, however, everything felt uncertain. Lauren had accepted the company's decision. That surprised many people, including me. She could have resigned immediately. She could have blamed everyone around her. She could have portrayed herself as a victim. Instead, she stayed. And that choice told me something important. For the first time, Lauren seemed willing to face consequences rather than run from them. The position she accepted was dramatically different from the role she once held. No direct reports, no management authority, no executive privileges, no special status. She would be working alongside people she once supervised. For someone as ambitious as Lauren, the adjustment was enormous. Some employees expected her to quit within days. Others assumed she would become bitter. A few predicted she would spend months trying to rebuild her influence. What actually happened surprised everyone, including Lauren. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after her reassignment, Karen Mitchell stopped by my office. She looked amused. "What's so funny?" I asked. Karen smiled. "You'll never guess who received 3 positive peer reviews this week." I raised an eyebrow. "Lauren," Karen laughed. "Lauren." That genuinely surprised me. Positive peer reviews were not easy to earn, especially after a public leadership failure. "What happened?" Karen handed me several reports. I reviewed them carefully. The comments were brief, simple. but significant, helpful, respectful, collaborative, supportive. I read the words twice, then a third time, because they described a version of Lauren I had never known. Later that week, Emily Foster requested a meeting. I expected another workplace concern. Instead, she brought unexpected news. "I think she's changing." I immediately knew who she meant. "Lauren." Emily nodded. I leaned back. "What makes you say that?" Emily considered the question. "She listens now." The answer sounded almost absurd, yet I understood exactly what Emily meant. People often underestimate listening. They treat it as passive, simple, easy. It isn't. Listening requires humility. And humility had never been Lauren's strength. Emily continued. "Last week she asked for feedback." I blinked. "Voluntarily?" "Yes." That almost made me laugh, because old Lauren would rather have swallowed nails than ask subordinates for feedback. Something really was changing. The transformation wasn't dramatic, not overnight, but it was real. One conversation at a time. One choice at a time. One lesson at a time. And perhaps that's how meaningful change always happens. Not through grand speeches, through daily decisions. At home, Michael seemed different too. Lighter somehow. More honest. The difficult conversation we shared after Lauren's hearing had changed him. For years, Michael had avoided conflict, avoided uncomfortable truths, avoided difficult choices. Now he seemed determined to stop hiding. One evening, he invited me over for dinner again. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. No tension, no awkwardness, no carefully avoided topics. Just family, real family. Halfway through dinner, Michael surprised me. "Mom, I owe you another apology." I looked up. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm. "I spent years pretending neutrality was kindness." The statement immediately caught my attention. Because it was insightful, painfully insightful. Michael continued. "I thought staying out of conflict made me a peacemaker." Lauren looked down at her plate, listening carefully. "But neutrality helps the wrong person when someone is being hurt." The room became quiet. I felt tears forming unexpectedly. Because my son had finally learned something many adults never learn. Silence is not always kindness. Sometimes silence is permission. Michael reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I should have protected you." I squeezed his hand back. "And I should have spoken sooner." Lauren's voice broke the silence. Both Michael and I looked toward her. She appeared nervous, very nervous. The confident executive who once dominated every conversation seemed completely gone. For a moment, she struggled to find words. Then she looked directly at me, and finally said what neither of us had ever fully addressed. "I'm sorry." The room fell silent, not because the apology was unexpected, because of how genuine it sounded. Lauren's eyes filled with tears. "I know I've apologized before." I nodded slowly. She was right. She had offered polite apologies over the years. Careful apologies. Strategic apologies. The kind people give when they want discomfort to disappear. This felt different. Very different. Lauren swallowed hard. "I never respected things I didn't understand." The honesty surprised me. "I thought education made me superior." Another pause. "I thought success made me important." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I thought your accent meant you were less intelligent than me." The words hurt, even now. But I appreciated the honesty, because healing requires truth, not comfort. Lauren looked directly into my eyes. And then I discovered who you really were. I remained silent, allowing her to continue. Her voice shook. The worst part wasn't finding out you became my boss. A tear rolled down her cheek. The worst part was realizing how wrong I had been about you. No one spoke. The room felt suspended in time. Lauren wiped her eyes. You spent years trying to love me. That statement nearly broke my heart, because it was true. Years of trying, years of patience, years of grace, years of hoping, and most of those years had been met with arrogance, not gratitude. Lauren finally lowered her head. I don't expect forgiveness. The sentence lingered, heavy, painful, honest. I looked at her for a long time. Then I thought about everything that had happened. The mockery, the humiliation, the investigation, the consequences, the growth, the change, the tears, the lessons. The truth was simple. Forgiveness didn't mean pretending the past never happened. Forgiveness meant refusing to live inside the past forever. I reached across the table, placed my hand over hers, and smiled. A small smile, a tired smile, a healing smile. You still have a lot to learn. Lauren laughed through her tears. So do I. The three of us laughed together. Not because everything was fixed, because healing had finally begun. Later that night as I drove home, I found myself thinking about Daniel. I wished he could have seen it. The growth, the reconciliation, the family beginning to mend. I parked in my driveway and sat quietly for several minutes, looking up at the stars, reflecting. Life had taken me somewhere I never expected. A woman mocked for her accent had become an executive leader. A son who avoided conflict had found courage. A daughter-in-law who valued status above character had begun learning humility. None of us were the same people we had been months earlier. And somehow, that felt like the greatest victory of all. Still, one final chapter remained. One final lesson. One final moment that would bring everything full circle. 6 months later, I found myself standing in front of a mirror adjusting the collar of a navy blue dress I hadn't worn in years. I smiled at my reflection. Not because I looked younger, not because life had suddenly become perfect, because for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at peace. The woman staring back at me looked familiar again. Not the frightened woman who sat crying in her car after Ryan's birthday party. Not the lonely widow who had forgotten her own accomplishments. Not the mother who spent years shrinking herself to avoid conflict. This was Haley Peterson, the real one, the one I had almost forgotten. The reason for the dress was simple. That evening, Whitmore Retail Group was hosting its annual leadership celebration. For decades, the event had honored employees, managers, and teams who demonstrated exceptional service and leadership. This year felt especially meaningful. The company had changed dramatically. Employee retention had improved. Workplace satisfaction had increased. Internal collaboration was stronger. Trust was slowly returning. Not because of me alone, because hundreds of people had chosen to build something healthier together. As I arrived at the hotel ballroom, dozens of employees greeted me. The reactions still felt strange sometimes. People respected me, valued me, listened to me, not because of a title, because of how I treated them. That difference mattered. One by one, familiar faces approached. Managers, store leaders, regional directors, frontline employees. Many stopped simply to say thank you, not for saving the company, for listening. The compliment meant more than any award, because listening had always been the heart of leadership. A few minutes later, I spotted Emily Foster across the room. I smiled immediately. Without Emily's courage, much of what had changed might never have happened. She walked over and hugged me. "You look happy." I laughed. "I am happy." "Good. You deserve it." I squeezed her hand. "No." I smiled. "We deserve it." Emily had recently accepted a promotion, a well-earned one. The difference was that this promotion came from genuine merit. Not politics, not favoritism. Merit, exactly as it should. As the evening continued, I found myself reflecting on how much life had changed. Not only professionally, personally. Michael and I had grown closer than we had been in years. The difficult conversations we'd endured had ultimately strengthened our relationship. For the first time in a long time, he no longer avoided uncomfortable truths. He faced them. That change alone felt like a miracle. And then there was Lauren, perhaps the most surprising transformation of all. 3 months earlier, she had begun mentoring new employees. Voluntarily. No recognition, no publicity, no strategic advantage. She simply wanted to help. The reports from coworkers were remarkably consistent. Patient, respectful, supportive, collaborative. Every time I heard those words, I smiled. Because they described qualities Lauren once dismissed as weaknesses. Now she was learning their value. Growth is a remarkable thing, not because it happens quickly, because it happens at all. The ballroom lights dimmed. The evening program began. Several awards were presented: outstanding store performance, customer service excellence, leadership development, community impact. The atmosphere felt warm, celebratory, hopeful. Toward the end of the event, the board chairman approached the stage. His expression carried a hint of mischief. That usually meant trouble, or surprises, sometimes both. He smiled at the audience. "This year, we'd like to recognize someone special." I immediately became suspicious. The chairman continued. "This individual reminded us that leadership isn't about titles." A few people glanced toward my table. I groaned quietly. Emily laughed beside me. The chairman wasn't finished. "It's about character." More heads turned. "This person helped rebuild trust throughout our organization." Now almost everyone was looking at me. I considered hiding under the table. Unfortunately, it was too late. The chairman smiled. "Haley Peterson." The room erupted into applause. I closed my eyes briefly, then laughed. The applause continued, longer than I expected, much longer. Eventually, I stood. Emotions suddenly filled my chest. As I walked toward the stage, I noticed something unexpected. Lauren was standing too, applauding, smiling, genuinely smiling. Not the polished corporate smile she once used, a real one. And somehow, that affected me more than the award itself. When I reached the podium, the applause finally faded. I looked out across hundreds of employees, hundreds of lives, hundreds of stories. And for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I spoke from the heart. When I was young, people often told me my Southern accent would hold me back. A few people smiled, others nodded. I continued. Over the years, I learned something important. The room grew quiet. People will always find reasons to underestimate you. Silence. But their opinions are not your identity. The audience listened carefully. I glanced briefly toward Lauren, then toward Michael. Both were watching. Both had tears in their eyes. I continued. Never be ashamed of where you come from. The words felt deeply personal. Never be ashamed of your voice. A pause. Never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on sounding like them, looking like them, or living like them. The ballroom remained silent. Completely silent. The good kind of silence. The kind that means people are truly listening. I smiled. My accent tells the story of where I've been. I felt emotion rising. It reminds me of family, of struggle, of resilience, of home. Several people wiped away tears, including me. I laughed softly, then finished. And after everything that's happened, I wouldn't change a single word of it. The applause returned, louder this time, stronger, warmer. When I left the stage, Michael hugged me first, tightly, longer than usual. "I'm proud of you, Mom." I smiled. "I'm proud of you, too." Then Lauren stepped forward. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Words weren't necessary. She hugged me gently. "Thank you." I looked at her. "For what?" Her eyes filled with tears. "For giving me another chance." I squeezed her hand, then smiled. "Just don't waste it." She laughed through her tears. "I won't." Later that night, after the celebration ended, I returned home. The house was quiet, peaceful, comfortable. I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and watched the stars. The same stars that had watched over me during heartbreak, humiliation, growth, forgiveness, healing. Life hadn't unfolded the way I expected. In many ways, it had been far more difficult. But it had also been far more beautiful. Because in the end, this story was never really about a promotion. It wasn't about becoming someone's boss. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about remembering who I was and helping others remember who they could become. As I sat there beneath the night sky, I smiled. Not because the journey had been easy, because it had been worth it. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt completely at home in my own voice. Life lessons and message. If there is one lesson I hope you take from this story, it is this. Never judge someone by the way they speak. A person's accent tells a story. It reflects where they came from, the people who raised them, the experiences that shaped them, and the journey they traveled through life. An accent is not a measure of intelligence, education, talent, or character. Too often, people make assumptions based on appearances, social status, income, education, or background. But life has a way of revealing truths that first impressions cannot see. Another important lesson is that silence can sometimes hurt as much as cruelty. When we witness someone being disrespected and choose not to speak up, we may unintentionally allow that behavior to continue. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage is simply saying, "That's not okay." This story is also a reminder that success without humility is fragile. Titles, promotions, and achievements are valuable, but they should never come at the expense of kindness, respect, and integrity. True leadership is not about power. It is about serving others, listening carefully, and helping people become better versions of themselves. Most importantly, never believe that it is too late to rediscover your purpose. Whether you are 30, 50, 60, or 80, your life still has chapters left to write. Your best contribution may still be ahead of you. And finally, forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiveness does not erase the past. It simply frees us from being trapped by it. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is choose grace when revenge would be easier. Thank you for spending this time with me and sharing this journey. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell me your thoughts. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of your background, appearance, accent, or life circumstances? I'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this channel with someone who might need this message today. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Thank you for being here.